How's everybody doing? Good. All right. I'm going to try not to use my notes. I tried not to over-caffeinate today. We'll see how well that goes. All right. First of all, a huge thank you to Michael and Jeremy and the entire DEF crew for inviting me to be here today. My name is Jessica Wright. I have spent the last 2 years conducting research on acquisition reform and innovation as a necessary but insufficient means to that reform. I'll try and sum that into 15 minutes and leave time for Q&A. So one of the things that I think is very fascinating about this innovation kind of movement is this idea that we all know that something has to change, right? And people will say things along the lines of, well, why can't we acquire things as fast as a country like China? And the reality of it is that we have socioeconomic goals that are in tension with the speed at which we can acquire weapon systems. And so once we kind of get past that first step, then it kind of opens a different environment into how you think about acquisition reform and what we can do with relation to innovation in that regard. So when I started out on my research, I wanted to think, okay, what is in the scope of what I can do? At the time, I thought it was gonna be 12 months of research. I thought I probably can't convince Congress to change. And then I learned about these socioeconomic goals and the things that keep us at tension, Competition and Contracting Act, and democracy, that make us who we are. So, okay, I'm not gonna change that. So what is in the span of control that I can change? And one of those things was the environmental factor and the attitude that you approach your work with. Now, typically I would start out a talk like this with trying to pull on the audience's heartstrings and talk to you about why you have to do things differently and why we can't keep going where we are, but you're here, you're a part of DEF, you're engaged. You already get that and how important this is. So I'll kind of skip past that, and what my aim here to do is to talk to you about how we can lead acquisition reform and keep the innovation boom going in an organizational culture that is inherently, by design, a bureaucracy, right? So when you think of the word bureaucracy, is there anybody here that doesn't think it's a bad word? Yeah, so yeah, right? So bureaucracy in and of itself is by design intended to be slow. It's intended to be repetitive, and then it's intended to be applicable to the lowest layer all the way up to the top, because we cannot always have a predictable workforce talent, and it has to be able to survive as numbers ebb and flow in the DoD. So given that, when we have innovation, something that is inherently designed to go fast, meeting something that is bureaucratic, inherently designed purposefully to go slow, those two things are in tension. And if I put innovation up against bureaucracy, one of the things that we know is that the bureaucracy will always win. Now, that doesn't mean that all our efforts here are for naught, but the idea is, how do we get people who are typically either more traditional or more bureaucratic in nature to come onto the team and be a part of the effort to move things through and acquire weapon systems and technology faster. There's a book called The Other Side of Innovation, and one of the things that he talks about, the authors talk about, there are two Stanford professors that are actually responsible for standing up the Design Think School, D School, out at Stanford, and they talk about how you can have innovation all day long, but if you pit your innovation cell against your, in this case, bureaucratic cell, they call it your performance cell, the bureaucracy will always win. It will inevitably always have the snowball effect to crush the innovation. So as innovators, how do we in an organizational culture work to pull the team members along with us, right? So in any organization, especially in a government one, we're gonna have C team players, B team players, and A team players. And our role together is to try and bring those C teamers up to B team to A team, and to keep the A teamers from getting too full of themselves, right? Because if anyone here is familiar with the Air Force Weapons School motto, the idea is to be humble, credible, and approachable in the way that we approach innovation or whatever your specific craft is, whether that's from logistician to flying the airplane, or like myself in terms of procuring the weapon system that the warfighter is going to use one day. So what are some ways that we can do that? One of the things is that I kind of already talked about like that us versus them mentality. You can't say, well, you're standing in the way of this. You're the reason that we can't get to a solution. But rather, if you kind of start the conversation with words like, can you help me understand? Or, I really like the idea that you're trying to, say, protect be a good steward of the taxpayers' dollars. Funny enough, none of us woke up just wanting to like spend it endlessly, right? We have that common goal. So where it's like, help me understand, or can you tell me a little bit more about that? And really working hard to onboard team members into the idea of innovation. So from an evolutionary perspective, it's also really important to understand that we as human beings have evolved less than 1% from a DNA perspective from cavemen. 1%. So inherently, it is actually ingrained in our evolutionary desire to remain alive, to resist change. So Daniel Kahneman will talk about the fact that because, thousands of years ago, the outlier to a pack would be either picked off or disregarded by the core group. So there's no reason by which to change. It was actually a protective stance to not differentiate yourself from others. Now add into that a military culture in which most of us have joined or have been a part of this deeply, deeply rooted military base for probably since we were in our teen years, and that's how we identify ourselves. So when we're looking at either senior ranking officers that are resistant to change, or senior ranking civilians that have kind of always done things a certain way, it is literally ingrained in their survival mechanism to be resistant to change. That's not something that we should just wake up and think that we're going to change in a day. It has to be a process that we kind of chip away at. The other thing that is particularly helpful in keeping kind of the momentum alive regarding innovation is recognizing that most of your team members, no matter how it may feel on the day, did not wake up wanting to come to work to do a bad job. Short of actual psychopaths, most of us wake up and come to work really wanting to do a good job. And so I think when you kind of break it down to that humanistic level, that's one of the things that really can kind of help level the playing field in terms of trying to get those that are very innovation-focused, creative mindset brought together with those that might be a little bit more resistant. And it's also fair to recognize that some people may push back against some of the change that people in this room are trying to really inspire because it scares them. They feel like they might lack the confidence or the knowledge base by which to move forward in those ideas, so they're going to stick to what they know. And that's really fair. But I think that kind of brings me to the final point before we'll go to questions is I think it's incumbent on us in this room and those that are out there kind of carrying this water for being engaged, empowered, inspiring. When I talk about raising that floor from C teamers to B teamers, B teamers to A teamers, is to teach and mentor others, right? So I talked a little bit about my thesis statement being that innovation is a necessary but insufficient means to acquisition reform. Well, the premise of that statement was that the Defense Acquisition University and the Defense Acquisition Workforce Improvement Act of 1990 that was designed to codify in law how we train our acquisition workforce, that is a very low bar. It is set in law, but it is the very bottom of where we need to start in order to move the workforce forward. So incumbent on everyone here, whether you know it or not, is a need for you to be able to teach and mentor and engage and empower those around you, not just the people that work for you, but there's a lot of managing up that comes in carrying new and different ideas forward that is incumbent upon us if we don't want to look back in the rearview mirror and see innovation as just another kind of reform that lasted but fizzled out and could have been more if. So I think that that is one of a huge opportunity space for the people in this room to go out back into your workplace and think about where people are coming from with regard to their resistance to change, how we can help level the playing field so that we can all approach from a common viewpoint to make things different and pursue goals of national security faster, hopefully cheaper, but it's unlikely. And then continue moving this innovation boom forward in such a way that we continue to be able to meet those socioeconomic goals at the same time that we're providing national security, not just for our own nation, but for all of those countries that rely on us for whether it be a nuclear umbrella or other means to security in the world. With that, I'll take some questions. I think I'm okay on time, Jer? Yeah? Okay. Questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Creighton Mullins. Quick question on, so what I was kind of juggling with and chewing on as you were talking was, I saw you had some joint experience in your background. I was looking at your bio. And we're not getting less joint, we're getting more joint. We're not getting less interagency, we're getting more interagency. So one of the challenges when we look at bureaucracies and innovation is it's no longer just one bureaucracy. It's a lot of bureaucracies with separate organizational cultures that we're working through. So with that, do you have a good example where you were able to drive innovation across multiple bureaucracies to accomplish, like, I guess, a big project or anything like that? Just curious of how you did it, if you have a good example of that.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of a project that I worked for, actually the Office of OSD&I. So we had the Air Force as the executive agent for something, and then we had 5 other major bureaucratic agencies in charge of it. Everybody had a vote. And I think that the thing that really helped me kind of cross those barriers is listening before I would project what I knew needed to be done. I knew I had something that related to national security that needed to be carried through, but understanding and working relationship building, I think honestly was far beyond any skill that I actually brought to the table, either through reading or anything like that. You guys will do breakfast with Mr. Gertz tomorrow, and I think one of the things that he is an absolute professional at is relationship building. And I think in our community that's got a little bit of a negative connotation, but understanding, coming to the table with operational credibility or professional credibility. It's not to say that if you don't have operational credibility, you can't come to the table and bridge that gap. But knowing your weaknesses, knowing what you're not smart in, respecting everyone's view at the table, and really just listening before you try and carry forward the message. And part of that too comes with understanding the personalities that you're dealing with, down to the point where I'm not gonna do a meeting with all 5 of the people in the room at the same time. I'm gonna need to individually manage these personalities separately, but have them all agree to the same thing I would have had them agree to if they were all on the table at once. But because biases exist, it's just reality, and people kind of come in with some preset viewpoints. I'd say that's one of the most successful kind of stories. It's very vague because it was a classified program, but I think that's a skill set that goes beyond program management. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so if I understood you right, though, you had a joint requirement that everybody was online.
Yeah. So that's very true, and that's one of the things that we know we have a shortfall with is with the requirement system. So the decision acquisition support systems that we have, whether they be the financial PPB&E or the requirements process and then acquisition. I think if you've read any of the Section 809 panel, there's starting to be a lot of talk about how that requirement system is insufficient. And I think even this next round of NDAA language, we're gonna see even more freedom to maneuver without hard codified requirements to get after difficult problem sets. Now, to get after that, I think it's incumbent on you or whoever's trying to carry that water to be armed with the relevant material, right? So you have to be read up on the NDAAs. You have to understand where your language is coming from, because that's your firepower. Read the Section 809 panel. Oh, did you know these 15 people that are pretty well regarded in industry all came together on this panel? And yes, it's 1,300 pages of 3 volumes of reports, but it's actually really, really worthwhile reading in there, because then that gives you your ammunition to go into somebody that says, no, that's not how we've always done it, and say, well, actually, here's why we need to do it differently, and this is where it gives me codified in law to talk through it. And then the other thing I'll say is it's also really important to understand what is law and then what is policy and statute, because that gives you also a lot of room to maneuver in terms of what you can get in terms